Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Innovating for a Greener Future. My name's Layla Sheldrick. I'm a lecturer at Imperial College, and I'm from the Dyson School of Design Engineering, which is part of Exhibition Road, and Imperial, which is part of the Exhibition Road Festival, which we're here as part of this evening. So welcome to tonight. Over the next hour, we're going to be talking about the future and about how to innovate towards a greener and more sustainable future. And with me, we have these three incredible alumni who have all graduated from Imperial and who have all gone on to do amazing things working towards sustainability in different ways. And so we're going to spend the evening together unpacking what works, what doesn't work, hearing their wisdom and their experiences of how they tackle these seemingly enormous challenges. And I have a million questions for them, and I'm really excited to dig into this, but we would love for you to be part of this discussion. So please use the chat to send in any questions that you have for our panelists tonight. You can do that if you're logged into YouTube by posting directly, but if you're having trouble, there's also this email here on the screen, which is being manned. So we're going to see your questions coming in if you send them there, and we can include them in the discussion. So do get involved. It's going to be a good one, and we would love to know what questions you have. So we have this incredible panel of three people, Flora, Iain and Ryan. I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you and talk a bit about the work that they've been doing. So we're going to begin with Flora, who graduated from Innovation Design Engineering. Flora, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Leila. Hi, everyone. I'm Flora. So as I just said, I graduated from the Innovation Design Engineering program 2 years ago. And since then, I've been living and working in Tokyo. So I'm a design researcher at the Loowatt Design Lab in one of Japan's largest technology institutes. And my work mainly involves collaborating with different scientific labs to turn emerging scientific research into new products or services or forms of dissemination or visions of the future. So this slide has a few examples of projects that I've developed over the last 2 years. On the top left is a picture of a project developed with a lab that specializes in battery technology. So we were exploring paper-based batteries that were disposable. The picture next to that was a project developed with a lab that specializes in shape memory polymers. So that was really great. We were kind of exploring the possibility of packaging that could be dynamic. The image following that is a project that was developed with a concrete engineering lab about using or kind of reusing and redesigning waste into commodities for consumers. And the last image after that is a recent project that was developed with a remote sensing lab about exploring forests and feeling kind of more connected to new remote environments. The images that you see on the bottom are actually of a virtual exhibition of several projects that I've developed over the last 2 years, which will be shown publicly in 2 weeks. So if you're interested in learning more about what we do at Design Lab, please feel free to come visit this digital gallery.
Brilliant. Thank you, Flora. Thanks so much for that great introduction. All right. And next up, we have Iain, who joins us from the mechanical engineering program originally, and now Loowatt. Hi, Iain. Welcome.
Hi, Layla. Hi, everyone. So my name's Iain Purves. I graduated from Imperial, I think, 11 years ago now. I did mechanical engineering. Since then, since graduating, pretty much the day after I graduated, I've worked for Loowatt, which is a waterless toilet company. So if you move on to the next slide. Just here, this is to highlight, the challenge that we're trying to solve, which is quite a big one. So over 2/3 of the world don't have access to sewered toilets, and a large proportion of those toilets aren't considered safe or dignified. That causes a lot of disease and death, as you can imagine, and the economic impact of that is huge, and not least as well. There's a social injustice, element to that as well. Why are so many people in the world don't even have a basic toilet. So how do we solve that problem? Next slide. So this is the toilet that we've developed, and it uses a polymer film as a means of packaging human waste. And that results in an extremely good user experience. So we don't need to use any water, and we can keep the toilet clean, and all of the waste is sealed away from the user. It creates a barrier between the user and the human waste, and it suppresses odor. So it provides a really fantastic user experience, which is quite unique for a completely waterless toilet. And this is something that could be suitable, or is suitable for going into, say, a single room dwelling in some of the poorest households in the world, as well as fancier versions, which we use in glamping and luxury events in the UK and construction and things like that. So the way it works is the film is loaded in and it carries the waste down using a patented mechanism we've developed into storage underneath. And then once all the waste is stored in the barrel, we then have to take it away and treat that. So there's a lot of interesting questions around that as well. Next slide. So this is a little bit complex, but this just shows the kind of approach to thinking that we have to take, which is quite systemic. So starting at the toilet, we aim to minimize materials usage in the toilet to minimize impact and get all of the benefits of using that material for the user. Then we have to look at logistics and transport and storage and things like that. And then we've developed separation technology, custom separation technology that removes the film from the waste and separates the two. And that allows us to optimally treat the human waste and the film separately, which is it's much easier to do basically than trying to treat both at the same time, we realize. So the human waste can then go off and we can recover energy and nutrients from the human waste, and it's undiluted, it's uncontaminated, so it's perfect for that. And then it can be safely disposed of or reused. And the separated film, depending on the type of film and what's available, can go through these different processes. Some are better than others. You could go through energy from waste, so it at least removes it from the environment. But ideally, and what we're building towards is recycling system. So if we can recycle that film, and we kind of have a technology roadmap for this now, if we can recycle that film, then the global warming potential is extremely low from the use of the film. So on the order of, say, 5 kilos of carbon per year per toilet, so extremely low. But the mitigation potential on the other end of the spectrum is very large. So just by the virtue of the fact that we can capture the human waste, instead of it going into a pit latrine and turning into methane, we can capture it instead. So we're actually in a position where we can achieve some climate change mitigation with the system. So that's an interesting aspect of it. Next slide. And yeah, this is just to show, some happy customers in the different contexts we're working in. So UK festivals and events, and Madagascar, where we have the most of our household toilets. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Iain. That's great to see some of the detail of it.
No problem.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay. So last but not least, we have Ryan. Now, Ryan studied global innovation design as a postgrad, but also his undergrad at Imperial in aeronautical engineering. And global innovation design is the program I run. So not that I'm biased, but it's very good. We produce wonderful humans.
It's a fantastic program. Thank you for the intro, Leila.
Sure.
So yes, I'm Ryan, founder and CEO of Petit Pli. We're a material technology company. We have a patent over this special textile technology, which grows in 2 directions. So typically a stretchy material, as you pull it along its length, it shrinks in its width. But our fabric, as you pull it along its length, it grows in its width. Next slide, please. So our first application is in children's wear. And this makes total sense because you can create a garment that grows through 7 discrete sizes, mitigating the amount of waste by quite a significant amount throughout the entire value chain. Next slide, please. So looking at the value chain, we use 12 bottles approximately to manufacture a set of Petit Pli garments. Instead of making 7 different sizes, we make 1 size. So it's a much more efficient process in manufacture. we also have a much lower return rate, and it's so much easier to manage our inventory, which, if you think about typical children's wear brands, can be a real logistical nightmare, having to manage all the sizes, make sure all the ones that you need are in stock for that time that the customer comes in and needs that item for their growing little human. Another thing that we're trying to do is nudge behavior. So looking at the next generation and seeing how can we provide materials to the parents so that they can then more easily educate the next generation on better consumption values and more responsible design and ethics. And finally, since we're mainly focused on e-commerce, we look at how we can mitigate the waste in that aspect too. So creating packages that fit in 95% of letterboxes in the UK, so you don't miss your delivery, but also that they can be folded like a toy and upcycled into a fun toy for the child to play with, rather than just having to throw the package away. Next slide, please. So as Layla mentioned, my background is in aeronautical engineering. We're actually specialized in deployable structures for nanosatellites. Involves a lot of research into origami and self-deploying structures. And that's essentially what trickled down into clothes that grow, which is quite interesting because I never thought at the very beginning that I would ever end up here with that. I then went to the Royal College of Art to do design engineering in the Global Innovation Design course. And that's where I really started to look at how I could use those technical skills and apply them to much more creative domains and have problem solving in a completely different method. Next slide, please. So now we're a team of multidisciplinary people, all approaching design in a completely different way, looking at challenges and building a really strong perspective from all of our different professions. So be it mechanical engineering, neuroscience, sociology, product design, fashion design, all coming together to see how can we actually add value to the system in one form or another. Next slide, please. We've gone on to adult wear, creating clothes that grow for adults, especially for maternity, where that can have a profound impact as well, because that user experience is terrible, and that's something that our users came back to tell us. We also last year released these Petit Pli masks, which have antiviral coatings. We won Times Best Inventions for it, and it's good because it's again made from recycled materials, and it sort of mimics and follows the contours of your face to give you a better fit, and they're much more comfortable, especially for hearing aid wearers, which we never expected, but they told us, which was a really nice insight too. Next slide, please. So finally, we've got a pop-up on Regent Street. So if you are interested in what we're up to, come and meet the team, since we're not in central London that often. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks so much. Amazing. So you've met all three and seen some of the work they do. And for me, in preparing for this and in seeing and talking to you about your work, it seems that aside from the sustainability factor, the obvious connection is that you're all somehow using design and engineering. Ryan, they're very obviously from doing one and then the other and now combining them in what you do. Flora, from doing a design engineering program, but now working with fundamental scientists to use design to kind of imagine possibilities and impact. And Iain, you've mentioned that you came out of engineering, but you've had to use lots of kind of the tools of a designer in navigating some of the more human, structural, situational challenges of actually deploying your product in the world. So maybe the best place to begin was with the big question, not a small one, but what do you think that combination of design and engineering has given you that makes you able to kind of create these impactful future solutions?
I can jump in there.
Mm.
I think one of the benefits was, in a way, being a jack of all trades and an expert in none, meaning that you can talk to lots of different professions and understand and be on the same wavelength, and you have a good enough amount of skill to be able to essentially start something from the ground up without having to have a huge team. And this is in my discrete case, where I had enough of the tools and knowledge to do different elements of what it took to start a business. And those discrete sort of roles, as the business has begun to grow, you start to bring on experts within the sector who can actually take that even to the next level and be so much better. And I think having that sort of multidisciplinary approach was really important in starting a business. And then the solution element impact side was important in sort of seeing how you could empathize with different stakeholders along the value chain and understand what they were going through, so that you could actually build a solution that could holistically approach all of their discrete challenges to somehow bring something that would, in a way, not cause disruption to people, but actually to try and add a little bit of value to everyone along the chain, and then thinking about it from a sort of systems approach. And I guess, I mean, I'm very sure that the other panelists, Iain and Flora, I guess you guys have sort of experienced the same sort of thing, or has it been a bit different?
Yeah, I think from the Loowatt side of things, it started out interestingly at the Royal College of Art in the I can't remember the name of the program, but it was in IDE, the Innovation Design Engineering department. Virginia Gardner, the CEO, started it. So it very much started out as a design project in a sense, and so it started as a kind of a nucleus, in the middle, and that central challenge of how do we provide a waterless toilet in an urban setting. So it's kind of a very clear but broad brief of a problem, and I think so. There's a lot of value in that, in starting a problem in that way. But I think toilets might be one of the best examples of this. It's such a multifaceted problem, as it's such a personal product for the user and a personal experience for the user, and there's a lot of cultural factors, gender factors, age factors, access factors that affect the design. But then as soon as you leave that user-centered side of it, you have to consider your waste and your logistics and the transport, what's going to happen to the waste, and then you start to get into more engineering, more scientific questions of, how much energy can we get out of it? How much is it going to cost to recover that energy? Can that be financially viable? What's the nutrient content? So that there are lots and lots of layers. So as we've gone on, and it's become it began as a systems problem as well, but it's grown over the years until we've had to really consider the full value chain for the consumables and the end of life consideration. So I think for me, I came into it as an engineer with no real design training or experience, and it's rubbed off on me, that design thinking's rubbed off on me, and I've had to learn, which I think I've taken on board. I've had to learn, that you're not going to create a solution unless you consider the user and you consider the stakeholders properly. Equally, I don't think you're going to create a solution if you haven't considered the engineering. You can come up with the best user-facing design that you want, but if it's fundamentally flawed, you might create, climate change disaster if you're not careful. So you have to think it through very carefully.
Absolutely amazing, thank you. And so, Flora, I know that you're operating at a slightly different part of the chain, but it feels like from what everybody's saying, it's still about the art of the possible and about that systemic thinking and showing people through engineering and through considering the humans what the benefits are. How do you find that in your role working at those early stages? How does this happen for you?
It's really interesting, that question about design and engineering, because for me, I always felt like engineering operates in the realm of kind of needs, and you have design that operates in the realm of desires. And then when you think about that in terms of climate change, it's like combining these two helps you really respond to the fact that sometimes consumer desires don't really match with needs. And I guess like having this plurality of perspectives, it really helps you to apply a kind of systems thinking from, I guess, the engineering side to solve problems, maybe more at their root, something that I think Petit Pli and Loowatt do really well. But I guess in my work, I'm having conversations with scientists at a really early stage for projects that might only happen in a few decades. But it's really nice because we're trying to kind of formulate or articulate some kind of vision of a future that is desirable. And I think it's quite important to work at things at their root. And I think this combination of points of view really helps do that.
Great. Well, I'm curious, I can see that some questions are starting to arrive in the chat, so keep them coming. I'm curious maybe to ask a detailed question about the challenges you're all facing in your roles. Like if you could wave a magic wand and have anything fixed for you for the future, what would that be? What do you think would help make a greener future from your perspective?
I feel like for me it's like if I could make anything happen, it's really just the ability to scale up like individual lifestyle choices on like a structural level, which I don't really have the chance to do in my work, but I really feel when I'm thinking about climate change, that's like the kind of main challenge that I can like conceive. And it feels really daunting, but I guess it kind of begins with understanding and framing climate change in a way that connects these different systems together. So just like not just technological systems, but also economic values and political dynamics and understanding how these things interact with each other. But yeah, if I could, I would really just like scale up small individual changes that we make in our lives.
Nice. For me, I always wonder, because often innovation can be quite energy intensive. So figuring out how much you can innovate, but such that the solution is actually much more energy efficient once it's adopted, and maybe trying to understand lots of different innovations and having a conversation between different companies or something where you can actually not have to redo work over and over again if it's already being done.
I'd say that it's all too easy now at the moment. Energy's, well, apart from the energy crisis we're going through, but energy's cheap effectively, and plastic is cheap effectively, and lots of materials are kind of cheap, and it means that it's very easy to scale a problem or create some throwaway thing or create something that uses energy all the time. And that's basically one of the big reasons why we're in the situation we're in. So if I could wish for anything, I think it would be like proper pricing, like pricing in sounds really boring, pricing in externalities for like materials usage. So like, if plastics are going to get used for some single-use application that isn't critical and the end of life's not being considered, that should be an expensive choice for the designer and the producer and the user of that material, unless it can be justified. So I think that would be very helpful, but that's like, wishing that governments got their act together and did something like that, I suppose.
It's okay. I feel like policy and behaviour are the two answers to basically all of these questions when it comes to the just transitions and sustainability. And this is the challenge. No, thank you. Awesome. We've had a really brilliantly bonkers question in the chat about designing a really far future. So part of this is about inspiring the next generation of designers. Is there scope for designing for a distant future of extreme resource depletion where we won't be able to make any more stuff? Now, it sounds like you've got amongst yourselves here even some really practical solutions already to how we do that. New separation technologies, products at last. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think you have to potentially, as much as possible, try to consider circular economy topics, and it's a kind of a buzzword kind of thing, like circular economy and circular materials usage. But I think designing for end of life, like, so there's end of life's kind of a catch-all term that also doesn't make sense, because if it's circular, then it's not really the end of its life. But recycling's kind of an end of life, and it brings a new life to that material. So I think it's kind of really essential that we try to design end of life, to design in at the design stage, plan what materials am I using. Is there an opportunity to design some specific process for this specific product that gets really good recovery, for example, from that material, rather than chucking it in and mixing it with lots of other materials? So segregating, recycling, and really planning for circular materials usage, rather than just allowing everything to somehow end up out of your control, mixed together, and then the problem becomes almost unsolvable. It's too expensive and difficult to recover materials. So yeah, I think circular economy topics are super important for that kind of future.
Yeah, I was gonna say that this future scenario doesn't seem, it seems quite distant and like quite far future, but actually I feel like it's quite realistic to imagine these kind of extreme situations. I think it was quite like this year I read summaries of the IPCC report, and I was quite shocked at I think I was just shocked at the like speed of the effects of climate change. And like the COP26 that's coming up, one of the goals is to make policies that would keep temperature rises below 2 degrees Celsius, which is actually like a very undesirable situation, because that already means like millions of climate refugees, like large sections of the world that would be uninhabitable. So the situations that we're in, actually, I don't think that designing for such a future scenario would be that unrealistic. And I do think it's important to think of situations in which we run out of resources.
Yeah.
I think Flora is definitely best placed to answer that question. I guess there was in GID, we looked at Dunn and Raby and speculative everything, and looking at designing scenarios in the future, and looking at how you could just use different lenses and different perspectives to look at those futures. So say XYZ materials are not available in 500 years, and then design that future. I think that might be a really interesting exercise to just see what potential outcomes are as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. We tend to do a lot of this futuring work these days. And Stephen, if you want to get really scared, as well as the IPCC report, I recommend looking at the Limits to Growth study and some of the recent things that have been tracking its development. That's really terrifying. We're not so far away from some of these things happening. So maybe then the next obvious question is, it's likely we have lots of other people listening who are feeling overwhelmed by the scale of these challenges and the enormity, but you're all working on your pieces of nudging the needle in the right direction. What advice would you give to anyone else setting out on this journey and wanting to start to make change, but perhaps not knowing how best to do it? What do you wish you'd known?
Good question. I think just quick fire, sort of a lot of guilt is placed on people to make the right decisions, and I think if you can pick and choose which decisions you want to make, and if you start small, that's pretty important, and it's a step in the right direction. I think being open to conversation and also maybe trying to somehow measure your impact, and in a way, just like trying to achieve any goal, measuring your KPIs in a way, and seeing how am I adding value or improving. I think a lot of people do have an urge to want to add value to their society, their family, their friends, their neighbors. And I think many people do naturally, and they often do it as like more of an extracurricular activity. But perhaps there's potential for scaling that positive impulse in a different way.
Yeah. Can you repeat the question again, Layla?
Yeah. It wasn't a small one, and I think I added two together, which was, what advice would you give to anybody setting out on this journey, and or what do you wish you'd have known?
Yeah, I think I would add to Ryan's point that there's a sort of it's impossible it's to do with scaling, some idea and some solution. It's always going to take time to scale something, and ideally, what you're creating is going to help mitigate the problem and not add to the problem, right? So I think that's kind of an obvious statement. If someone's setting out and they want to make a difference in this realm, then try and create something that's going to make the problem better, not make it worse. So then there's the issue of scaling, but you can't scale you can't design something perfectly the first time, and you can't scale it immediately either. So there'll be limitations as you scale as to what you can achieve. Like you can't, there might be some financial constraints you just can't get around. You might have to use the wrong material to start with for prototypes, or when you're in manufacturing at like a batch scale, for example. I think you just have to be aware of those and then confidently move forward, but at the same time know where you're going. So like look forwards to that larger scale, plan for that larger scale, so you're confident that this solution's right, and it's okay now if it's not perfect, but know where it's going. That's it, and that's been something that, as Loowatt's progressed over the years, that we've got a clearer and clearer vision as we've gone. But in some sense, I wish earlier on we'd almost dug in deeper and tried to create that vision earlier. But hindsight, it's easy to say in hindsight, but that would be my advice. Look forwards as far as you can.
Yeah, so what kind of advice? Yeah, I think when you think about climate change, it can be very easily very depressing to understand how much of an effect humans have had on this planet. But at the same time, I feel like you could also argue that it's kind of empowering to know that we are like the cause of this, because we can also be the solution to it, or like if you're the source of the problem, then you can surely stop making that problem. And yeah, coming back to what Ryan was saying, I do think like it's kind of about engaging in whatever way you can in your context, having conversations with people. For me, like moving to Japan, for example, and talking about climate change with people just from another culture was like extremely eye-opening. It doesn't mean the same thing. I'm sure Iain would understand this as well, but climate change and its effects and the moral responsibility behind it doesn't mean the same thing when you cross a border, when you speak a different language, when you have a different history. It's really quite interesting. The other part was something that I wish I'd known. I'm not sure. There's many things I wish I knew. I'm not sure, but yeah, I think just like being able to understand, have conversations, and engage in whatever way. Like this year, for example, is the first year I actually got involved in the politics of my country. It's like really random, but I decided to get really interested in politics. I'm actually French, so I've been watching all the debates. I even voted at the primaries of the Ecological Party. It is not really something that I have any interest personally or like expertise in, but I do think it's very easy to step into realms where you like to make a first step into realms that you're uncomfortable with, and it's okay. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. I think you've all been telling quite a coherent story so far, really, of the need to scale up behaviors and to start small and to accept that you're going to need to kind of invest some time and energy, literal energy and resources in the first steps in order to get things moving. And I think they're all really, really useful, practical things for people to be aware of. I know that whenever I have a kind of consultancy project or I start with someone who doesn't know anything about sustainability, it's always like the first eye-opening thing is telling them there's lots of grey areas and there's no correct answer. People come expecting that there's like a correct and most sustainable way to be, and that's just not the case. And so I always think that's the first bubble that has to be burst. So it's good advice. Do you have any kind of stories from the field of these sorts of things, of stuff that you've had to overcome, of where you've had to perhaps use your storytelling or your human-centeredness or your engineering and your kind of evidence in order to kind of help get over a hurdle with the challenge that you were facing?
Yes, in the good way. I mean, every day brings over new challenges, and you always find yourself, or I always find myself sort of in the deep end, in a new field that I don't know much about, and then you just need to essentially problem solve to get to the end. I think in terms of what Flora was talking about earlier about being in different cultures and trying to quickly understand those cultures is also really important. We sell our products around the world, and having an idea of who's purchasing and why they've made that decision to support your brand is very interesting and insightful. So, for example, I mean, you can have that impulse to have that positive impact on the world, and you can create a solution that does that. And then speaking to the points earlier of creating something that was desirable and commercially viable and being able to scale that, people might not make the decision to purchase or adopt your solution because of the sort of sustainability credentials. But I think something that's interesting is that it doesn't matter anymore, because if someone is making that purchase because of another reason, but it is having a sustainable and more responsible sort of effect through your own supply chains as a business, and also through the messaging that you can then proliferate into the next generation. In our case, I think that's a really interesting insight that's happened over time as we have grown, because obviously we'd be really much more selective and more precious about everything at the very beginning, and we were just like, oh, people who love sustainability need to see this product, but if you're not interested in sustainability, it's kind of, we don't want to talk to you kind of thing. But then as you evolve, you understand that you can actually nudge mass behavior to promote their consumption. I think that in itself is really interesting.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Evolution, not revolution. Nothing. Iain.
Yeah, I think it's been an interesting process, designing a new type of toilet from scratch. And like I said before, it's extremely kind of user focused, quite a potent kind of topic, and very interesting topic that a lot of people, everyone has something to say about, and everyone has a certain cultural bias to kind of bring to it, and different countries around the world have such different cultures around it. But I think the approach that we took, which I think is has meant that what we have, I believe is quite successful, is that we've always focused on the quality of experience for the user, and it being such a personal thing and such an important thing to achieve a high level of experience, not just to say we're going to make the most ecological toilet that ever existed, because they already exist and they're not adopted for a reason, and they're not rolled out for a reason. They're not high standard. And they have certain user barrier implications, such as just a regular compost toilet, right? I mean, there's a certain aspect of that which is, if you're into it, then you're going to be, I'm dealing with my human waste. That's the experience level. There's some interaction in a sense with my human waste. And if you try and say, so if we went to Madagascar and said, we're rolling these toilets out and we're imposing that, the users are more than likely not to enjoy that experience, not to want that. So I think the success of Loowatt's product has come from that real focus on user experience. And I'm pleased to say that more or less we've had an extremely positive user experience from many different cultures, which has been really surprising to us, including recently in South Africa, where there's quite an interesting history around bucket toilets and apartheid, and bucket toilets being used in townships. So there's a really interesting culture there, really potent culture there, and we've had good experience there as well. So I think it really is about focusing on the user and making sure that you give them the absolute best experience you can and give them something that they want. Because I think ultimately, if people don't want the product, you're not going to be able to, or the service or whatever it might be, then they're not going to adopt it, then you're not going to scale. So
yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Flora.
Yeah, I think for me it was, the biggest hurdle is maybe has to do with narrative a little bit. It's kind of interesting when I don't know if any of you have been to Japan, but when you get here, you feel both really close, but also very distant to the idea of nature. Like, there's so many streets and banks and buildings and companies. Like, there's so many symbolic references to nature in this culture. You can see it on screens kind of everywhere, but it's never really in focus. And the idea of climate change is kind of like that as well. It's never really in focus, and you feel like it's kind of always being displaced. When I talk to scientists, sometimes I kind of feel like I kind of have the same feeling where I feel like we need to kind of collapse the distance between the idea of nature and climate change and the human realm. And I'm often kind of facing a hurdle of having a conversation with like techno-solutionism a little bit, because I'm working with people whose life is around like technological innovation and scientific research, and it's very precise, it's very interesting, and they're all very talented. But often it's like extremely focused on technology as a solution. And one of the examples I like to think of is like this idea of negative emissions, which is often associated with like carbon capture technologies and forest replantation projects, which are all really great. But in the last few years, we've realized that they're also very problematic, that they have never been proven to work on a scale, and that they require a lot of money. And on some level, I think maybe it would be cheaper at the end of the day to not emit these, to not put these carbon emissions in the atmosphere in the first place. So this is kind of the type of, it's the type of confusing situation that I have to navigate sometimes with scientists, because they come from a point of view that is a little bit different from mine, and it's all about how we tell the story of climate change and how we understand it. So yeah, that is my challenge.
No, it's a good point. And actually, it's a really beautiful point to lead us on to one of the questions we've got asked, both Flora and Ian's points. We're being asked if there's a system within which money isn't limiting access to resources. So you mentioned there's some of the economic challenges to be overcome to get innovation out there. But Iain, you also touched on some of the best and cheapest solutions not necessarily being ones people want. Do you guys have any ideas on this?
Yeah, I'd say it's a difficult question, but I would say just one interesting point that's coming up recently within the sanitation industry is carbon credits. So I think, as I said, I mentioned on one of my slides, there's this carbon mitigation, potential of sanitation done in the right way, and I think, and therefore there can be a certain financial value attached to that. So this isn't quite answering your question, but I think there's some interesting kind of like financial angles, and it also comes back to, I think, to pricing in carbon, pricing the cost, the externalities into carbon properly, and understanding the value of that mitigation potential, which is probably undervalued, because if we're not kind of properly understanding the cost of carbon, then we're obviously not valuing the mitigation enough, if you get my drift. So I think there's some potential there when we look at these systems design approaches to think more about that value and how some of that finance, can be claimed back to at least help offset some of these system costs we might see. That's just kind of one angle on it, perhaps.
But then I guess it still involves money, which
True.
I wonder. I wonder if tomorrow there were just grants that were given left, right, and center, and they were just for sort of positive companies. Then you'd have to measure, well, is this company doing a more positive solution than that company? And then how do you measure one sort of responsible act versus another responsible act in a completely different domain? And then how do you compare them? I think, it's a really good question, but really tough.
Yeah, it is. I feel like for that to work, or at least, I guess for money to not become a kind of limiting factor, I feel like there would kind of need to be a proper rigorous accountability mechanism where climate liability can really be measured and sanctions can be implemented, and that's done not just on a governmental level but on a corporate and individual level as well. I read somewhere that just 10% of the more privileged part of the global population is emitting more than half of emissions, which is really terrible. But I think a lot of the issues that money can kind of justify in our current flawed system could be maybe resolved if there was a proper sanction system of some kind.
Yeah. I think you're all highlighting in general the challenge with picking any one of the factors. If it's money that's the factor, or like the last question, if resources are limited, then how do you respond? Or if we use carbon footprinting, then how do we reorient the system? And whichever metric we choose completely impacts the design, what you're aiming for, what's considered good. And I think that's one of the most challenging things with sustainability. But as you've all covered, it's more about thinking about it holistically. And I guess, where do you need to consider what factors, whether resources of water or energy or those kinds of things? What do you have? What is scarce?
Just to add to it as well, perhaps, I think that goes back to a little bit of what I said earlier about, it's very easy to create a climate problem by using lots of materials and fuel in whatever you're doing. But there's obviously also an opportunity in that the materials are cheap and you can do amazing things with them, and they can help you, deliver really useful services to your users and customers around the world, fundamentally, but also perhaps help use those materials very wisely to help you mitigate climate change. And I think technology is just super, super important for this ultimately. I mean, I think if you take examples of, say, like the telephone network that we had, in the West, and it's, we built our infrastructure, and then that got leapfrogged by mobile technology. So, in many countries that didn't have a telecommunications grid, they just didn't need it, and they just moved straight to mobile, and that's amazing, and that's facilitated by mobile phones. So that gave those services, that meant those services were available because of technological improvement. So I think that a similar thing is true in sanitation. So why build a sewer when a sewer is really expensive to build, maintain, operate, and makes recovering resources difficult, when you could have instead like a logistics model for human waste like you do with refuse. So I think there are different models that you can look at, and I think technology is super important, and like judicious use of materials. Then I think you can deliver a lot of the services that we need to deliver for people all around the world, improve their livelihoods, but not create a climate disaster at the same time.
Yeah, considering all your decisions carefully. That's brilliant. Thanks, Iain. We have a few specific questions, quite a few specific questions about Loowatt in general and Petit Plis. So for Loowatt, there's a series of questions. The first is, could the Loowatt toilet be made compact enough for SUV camping or even hiking?
Hiking, well, maybe in the distant future somehow. Yeah, I think a similar sort of toilet could be developed for hiking if you wanted to like carry all of your human waste out with you. Yeah, maybe. But in terms of RVs, yes. So it can be compact. It's actually going to become more compact in the future when we iterate the design. That's something we've had to. It's actually become an important design consideration. Is the height between the bottom of the toilet and the toilet seat. So in a regular toilet, you've just got the toilet bowl with some water at the bottom, so you don't have necessarily a great deal of height. Whereas we have a mechanism that needs to deal with the film and pull that through. So the depth of that mechanism actually became quite a key design constraint in order to keep the height of the seat low enough, because otherwise you need a step to then go up to the toilet, which is a little bit awkward. So yeah, it's going to become more compact, but the simple answer is yes, and we pretty much already have that. We have very, very small barrels. We have very short refills of film, and even a short refill of film can last a little while. So yeah, essentially we have that already.
That's awesome. Great. And then the next one is, have you considered recovering or reusing the NKP in urine as a byproduct? It's very specific.
Yeah, so yeah, that's nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus in the urine, and other nutrients in the feces as well. Yeah, so human waste is full of those things, and unfortunately, often that goes to waste, and even worse, it ends up just getting into groundwater and getting into rivers and lakes and causing eutrophication, which is and can be a big ecological problem. So stopping that happening is the first thing. If you can stop that going in the wrong place, that's great. And then ideally you would be recovering it into some form that can be reused. And yeah, so the simple answer is yes. So in Madagascar, we run anaerobic digesters where we process all the feces and the urine together, and we generate biogas. And we use the biogas to pasteurize the human waste going in. So we're killing all the human pathogens. And then we take the output, which is a liquid, which has the solids removed, the organic solids through digestion are removed, but it leaves a lot of stable organic compounds and also nutrients. And then we can take that and we can process that and condition it into soil amendment products, fertilizer products. So we have a separate business in Madagascar that does that. It takes what's called the digestate, the liquid, and then we co-compost it with straw. And we also use worms to create a vermicompost product. And we also create a kind of a conditioned liquid kind of product as well. And all of those products have the NPK left in them, or a lot of it anyway. And then that can then be used for growing food, basically. Yeah.
Wow, that's brilliant. Very cool. And I think it answers the final Loowatt question, which is, does Loowatt work alongside existing waste management plants, or do they need their own separate plant?
Well, it doesn't quite answer that question. Oh. So we have built our own digesters in Madagascar, but we also work with existing digesters in Madagascar as well, purely for, scaling this. You can overcomplicate it, and you'll never you'll require too much investment, or it's too difficult to scale. So we draw a certain boundary now around what we do. So we have the toilet product, and we kind of offer advice to customers. But when we go into a new market, we're not necessarily selling digesters or selling processing equipment, apart from for separating the film. Right. But once we've done that, then we work with what's available locally. So that might be conventional wastewater treatment facilities. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Great. Thank you. And thank you for all the questions. Ryan, Petit Please, yes. Up next. What are the plans for expansion, for world domination? And are you looking at other applications for your design?
Yes. So the sort of direct consumer element of the business has really allowed us to have a direct line of conversation with users to gain an understanding of again, the different cultures and how they perceive petit plis. I mean, we've seen petit plis kids wear being used in christenings, and we've seen it used in playgrounds. So people don't quite know how to sort of adopt this new design, which is so alien to the real world. But something else from that is understanding the sort of properties of the textiles and how we can manipulate those further for different environmental conditions. And so by having that direct line of conversation and that closed loop feedback system with our users, we're able to really understand and gain feedback on how we should use our textile technology. For example, we brought out maternity wear earlier this year, where it's again taking the same sort of ethos and trying to ingrain supply chain efficiencies and an improved user experience, but also looking at more extreme cases of other industries that we can apply our textile to try and achieve different solutions. So we've built a digitized materials library of over 2,000 different tests with different fabric compositions and different layups and things like that. And from that, we're able to say, okay, if we want to collaborate with this company and they need a problem solved, we can apply our textile. We need XYZ properties, and then we can go into our library and find those properties and then use our intense knowledge of construction methodologies to try and solve that problem.
Wow, cool. Okay, so the possibilities are endless, it sounds like.
I mean, yeah,
We'll wait and see.
Textiles are all around us in our everyday lives. And I think there's so much further that they can do and can be. The loom was basically the origin of the computer. So there's a lot of work that can be done, I think, in this relatively archaic industry.
Brilliant. Well, we're basically up for the hour, our allotted time. So thank you so much for answering everybody's questions. Thanks to everyone who sent them in. As perhaps a final send-off for all of the people listening, what last bits of wisdom would you have to share? What encouragement would you give to somebody setting out to make a greener future? Last words.
I'd say that, whatever industry you might be working in now, or maybe you're not working in industry yet, but whatever you're working on, I think that in general, most industries are part of the problem, not the solution, at the moment, and some are bigger than others. And I think that, assuming that we have to solve the big ones, and if we don't, then we're really, in trouble. So assuming that those are solved, the smaller ones become more and more significant over the next 10 or 20 years. So I think it's really important to not think, my area or my industry is not such a big percentage. It's only 3%. Well, in 10 or 20 years, it could be 20% of the problem. So I think it's important that whatever industry you're in, you try and look at whatever ways you can and whatever you're working on to think about what materials you're using, think about reducing energy consumption, think about end of life, what's going to happen to those materials when your products are finished, really, and taking responsibility. Basically, as far as you can.
Brilliant. Thanks, Iain.
One thing is that sustainability was always looked at as in a really sort of uncool lens. And I think that it can be really interesting and desirable and can push forward innovation and humanity. And I think that reframing sustainability and responsible design efficiencies, it's great for the bottom lines of companies, and it's great for humanity as a whole. And so I think there's definitely a reason that can be adopted by different stakeholders, from the consumer to the workforce to the overarching company, and still add value to society.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sure.
I feel like everything's been said, but yeah, I basically agree with Iain and Ryan with the fact that it's quite daunting, the speed at which climate change is happening, but it's also very but it's made me very optimistic to see how many initiatives, like sustainable initiatives, have been multiplying around me. Everyone's quite interested in it, and it makes a lot of sense because we all share this planet, and then we're all really concerned by this problem. So yeah, I would say it's quite urgent to kind of engage in any way that you can. And whatever that way is, even if it's just like a small individual lifestyle choice, it still is very important. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
It's a brilliant, excellent closing sentiment. Thank you so much. It's so lovely to get to chat to you all. Thank you for being here this evening. Thanks to everyone in the audience as well for joining us. It's been a lot of fun to pick your brains and hear stories from the front line. So thank you for sharing. That's all we have time for. That's the hour. So thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of the Great Exhibition Road Festival and all the stuff that's going to be happening. It's been wonderful to spend the evening with you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time. Good to see you all.
Thank you so much.